Welcome to the Product Design Podcast. I'm your host, Seth Coelen, founder of UX Cabin, where we create world-class web and mobile apps. I'm excited to bring you a behind-the-scenes look into the lives of some of the most interesting and talented people in product design. We'll get strategic advice on how they got to where they are today and things they wish they would have known earlier in their career. Hey, welcome everyone to the Product Design Podcast. We got a really exciting guest, probably needs no introduction, but we have Brad Frost, the creator of the Atomic Design Philosophy, design systems guru. Brad runs his own consultancy where he helps people with design systems and helps get companies using them effectively. So Brad, super pumped to have you here. Thank you for joining us today.
Super pumped to be here. Thanks for having me, Seth.
Absolutely. So yeah, for those who don't know you, why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are, where you live, and what you do?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm based in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I'm a front-end developer by trade, but basically over the last 10 years, coming up on 10 years, actually, I've sort of been out on my own. I come from an agency background. I used to live in New York City, working at an agency called RGA. And whenever I moved back to Pittsburgh, where I'm from, born and raised in the general area, I sort of set out on my own. And so I do kind of a constellation of different things, but increasingly over the last 10 years, it's been really kind of around helping organizations sort of stand up and build and evolve design systems. So as a result, I get to sort of duck my head into a bunch of different companies and company cultures and things of all shapes and sizes. And with this kind of lens of sort of how do we create successful design systems? So it's been a lot of fun. So there's talks, workshops, training, but like also we dig in and we actually like sort of help sort of graft onto our clients' teams to help them sort of, show them the ropes. So we will kind of design and build our design systems with our clients, but always kind of like through like a teach a team to fish thing. It's like, it's not like a normal agency where we're like trying to like have a retainer forever and ever. It's more like what do we need to do to sort of get you to a successful place and then see ourselves out the door. I like gigs where you're like trying to make yourself obsolete. So it's been a lot of fun.
Very cool. Well, it sounds like an exciting background in history. So you said you started off in front-end development, kind of got yourself into the industry. Why don't you take us back to kind of the origin story of Brad and how you got into the space?
Yeah. It's all right. So I went to James Madison University in Virginia, and I went as a music major, and I was very interested in like music production and like recording engineering and sort of things like that. And after an unpaid internship, of course, at a venue, I decided it wasn't the right sort of fit for me. And in short, I love music too much to have it sort of sullied by some pretty wild experiences and just kind of different personalities. Anyways, so I changed into a major called Media Arts and Design. And in that program, we had a Flash class and we had a Dreamweaver class, and I was playing in a band and my band needed a website and all that, that stuff. Yeah, if you sort of poke
the
around,
stars aligned.
Yeah. If you poke around the industry enough, you will find many sort of musicians turned web designers and developers, and I think that's a big reason. My band needed a website. So I graduated in 2007 and got a job in a real estate company making websites for that. And so whenever the sort of financial sort of collapse hit, especially that industry,
wow,
sort of things happen. And my now wife ended up in New York City after we graduated. She was going to move to Pittsburgh, but then I ended up moving to New York. So I got a job developing websites first at like a small kind of boutique agency that made like kind of fashion e-commerce websites and stuff. And then ultimately made my way to a bigger agency called RGA. And when I landed at RGA, I was hired as a mobile web developer. Now, so this was like before responsive design, the iPhone had come out, but like the whole kind of web industry like wasn't really paying attention, I guess, to like what this sort of new mobile technology could do. And like, I was like building like BlackBerry optimized sites for night and
Nice.
stuff like that. So that was really fun. But so I kind of ended up in this, what ultimately was this, right at the sort of cusp of this sort of mobile explosion, and trying to figure out how to make web stuff, work with that. And so that sort of was kind of there at sort of like the beginnings of responsive design. And, how do we make these experiences that work well? Like just even, I did a project for Nike, is like it was Apple is coming out with this new device, and we want people to be able to sort of go to Nike.com on it. Like Apple wants people to go to Nike.com on it and have this optimized experience. So it's like kind of like working on like the first like iPad.Nike.com kind of experience.
Yeah.
This device that didn't even exist yet. So it was like, it was really fun to kind of be there, like kind of on the cusp of this, but also just sort of brave new world, right? Brand new territory, not a lot of like tried and true solutions. So it was really fun to be there. And sort of, it was by way of that experience that I kind of, as we started creating these more sort of flexible, fluid, responsive experiences, it sort of started hitting me of like, well, making this page responsive isn't the issue. The issue is the navigation, right? How do we sort of go from a horizontal list of links on a large screen to what do we do on small screens? And like, how do we sort of convert the one to the other and stuff like that? And so that was like kind of how I started getting more into sort of like thinking about things in terms of like components. Cause it's like most of this experience just kind of like, flexes and is fluid just kind of by default, or like, if it's an image slideshow, like a Netflix type, sort of carousel type thing, like that's fine. Like it just kind of, ebbs and flows and shows more as the screen size gets bigger. But for some of these other things like data tables or accordions and tabs and navigation and like all of this stuff, it was just like, oh, what do we do with this? And I started getting like asked all these questions by my colleagues, but also I have like a blog. And so, started writing about this stuff, but also created a project called This is Responsive, which was kind of,
I remember that,
collecting these patterns of like, here's 10 different ways you can slice navigation, or here's all of these different sort of fun interface patterns for converting a data table into like a key value sort of list on small screens and things like that. So that's kind of what got me into, again, sort of more like kind of component driven sort of stuff. And then it was whenever I sort of set out on my own and sort of latched on to my collaborator who I'm still collaborating with a decade later, Josh Clark. He got a gig to do the first responsive redesign of TechCrunch.com, which is like a technology blog.
Yeah.
And he's like, hey, do you want to help develop this? And it was through that project that I was like, I kind of like have this idea for like thinking about components in like a very sort of like deliberate and hierarchical way. And so that was kind of the birth of Atomic Design, was us kind of doing this stuff as we are kind of creating these projects. So the first day is like sort of like a decade ago. It wasn't TechCrunch reaching out saying, hey, we need a design system. Like, in fact, they threw all that in the trash can. Like, they were more interested in the responsive website, and we delivered that. But we also created some software that ended up sort of evolving through the help of others, called Pattern Lab, which was like kind of a precursor to Storybook, if you will, where it's like, here's this, you could kind of navigate around. Oh, we want to drill in and just view these buttons in isolation. We want to be able to sort of see what a button looks like in the secondary version of it, or a button that has a longer string of text in it and stuff like that. But that was kind of the vehicle that we used to create this new responsive website, where it's like, oh, TechCrunch has an article template. So, okay, we had to create that. But then we needed to see, what the article template look like whenever you have a YouTube video embedded within it, or it's a press release instead, or a short form article versus like a 5,000 word, essay.
Right.
So it's kind of like all of these things kind of came together, and yeah, that's what became Atomic Design. And ultimately, once we kind of had a couple projects under our belt, I ended up sort of, writing blog posts about it and talking about it at conferences, and then ultimately created a book to sort of capture those ideas. And it's that, as they say, is history, I guess.
Yeah. No, that's a great overview. So I got my start a few years later, and it was just like, I wanted to ask this of you, like, I was getting started like 2010, 11, 12, kind of finding my way. And looking back, it feels really weird because like I didn't really even know that there was a difference at that point in time between like front end and back end, between like graphic design, UI design, and UX design. And it was all just kind of like melded together. Yeah. And so I actually got my start in front end as well, but I thought it was just like web design. Like I'm a web designer. Like,
yes. Yeah.
And I'm curious from your point of view is like, when do you think the roles started to become more like clearly defined and separate?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting perspective, and you I feel like a taste of it, of like the last days of like the webmaster days, right? That was the thing. And like, it's always fascinating. There's like, people I really respect that have been, doing this stuff since like the mid 90s and stuff. And it really is like you do the graphics, you do like literally everything. And even in my first gig in New York City, it's like when the internet went out, it was like, Brad, go fix the internet. And so there was this just like kind of, especially like with like all things, certainly on like the development end, it's just like code, you do code. And it's like, there are many different kinds of code, and like it's in like the industry, I think like a long time in it. And it's still sort of something that I have to sort of, get on my soapbox again and again and again. I ducked my head into, as I said earlier, a lot of different companies, and so many people and so many companies don't have that nuanced kind of split between what I now call kind of front of the front end, which is like UI development, HTML, CSS, presentational JavaScript. You can make an accordion open and close. You can make a modal close. You can do those things, but more it's about the structure, solid, accessible foundation for all your front end code, sound CSS architecture. And that's like super hard to come by. And then JavaScript, but it's really like the subset of JavaScript, because now JavaScript is kind of like eating the whole back end. So now it's, you do JavaScript, like do all this routing and cache invalidation and like, ping the server for like these things and make these API requests, write this middleware. And I'm like, that was always the thing. Like whenever I was at RGM, like my mom is an art teacher. It's like, I can do this stuff. You don't want me to do this.
Right.
This is like an exercise in frustration. And then the same thing sort of holds true on the design end of things, right? Where it's like, you had this like, you do Photoshop. And that means at the time, Photoshop was the only kind of interface game in town. Smart objects were barely a thing. And so it's like, it was like, how to do this. So you do it all and like edit these photos and do all of that. And so I think that it really has just, I think it's just a sign of the evolution and journey and growing up of this industry, that it's just like, okay, what are all the types of things that need to get done, and try to start to sort of build sort of some T-shaped teams of people that sort of specialize in certain areas. And that's been, again, a big part of my role is that like more often than not, a lot of my recommendations as a consultant is you all need like a front end specialist. Like you need like oftentimes you have like Figma covered, or you have like the sort of, sort of static design tool specialist covered. Oftentimes you have sort of like more of like what could be called like a traditional engineer, programmer, somebody with CS background. Oftentimes you have those people covered. But then the sort of like gooey bits in between, I kind of call them mortar people.
The people who love CSS.
That's right. Yeah. They're hard to come by. So it's a great time. If like that's your jam, it's like a really good time to be shopping around for jobs. So if my client work is any indication, it's just like the world is your oyster. But like sort of same with, I think, like a lot of just sort of interface designers in general. It's like to kind of like focus on that kind of stuff. It is, at this moment in time in pretty high demand.
Yeah. So wanted to dig into, you did this project, you kind of solidified in your mind, like a way to organize components for websites. Maybe first off, give us just like a really high level overview of the philosophy of atomic design.
Sure. Yeah. So basically, like any user interface, you can explode into its smallest bits. And when you're sort of like left with those smallest bits, those are like the atoms of our experience. Just in the same way, you could explode any piece of matter on this world or in the universe and be left with this sort of handful of atomic elements, carbon, iron, oxygen, hydrogen, all of that stuff, except we have buttons, text, nodes, sort of things like that.
Yep.
And it's like they can't be broken down any further, right? That's the spirit of atomic design. Those things are the building blocks of all of our interfaces, but they're not terribly useful on their own. A lot of times, like especially like back in the day, like the early days of style guides, it's like, here's our type scale, and you're like, cool. Or like, here are these things, and it's like you don't know how to use them, right? Necessarily. Right. So sort of like, and sort of some historical context was like, at the time, things like Bootstrap came around, and the kind of narrative around it was like, here's this like kit of parts, and you could build things out of it. And by and large, that sort of mentality still kind of holds true today, which is why I continue to find atomic design useful, is that it sort of takes more of a complete and holistic look at this stuff rather than you have components and you build things out of those components. That's true, but it's a very coarse narrative. So the atomic design is like, okay, you have these like smallest bits. Those smallest bits form together, a couple of them, into a relatively simple component that I call a molecule, right? Just like hydrogen, oxygen atoms bind together to form a water molecule. We instead have a label, an input, and like a little sort of text field for like some helper text come together to form like a text field component. And now that thing is useful, right? Now you can start wielding this thing. And then sort of at the organism level, we sort of take these molecules and maybe other atoms and sort of combine those together into relatively complex components. So you might have like a header organism component that is comprised of the logo, the primary navigation, a search form, and like those things that sort of takes on its own property and has its own behaviors and responsive behaviors and things like that. And then sort of from there, we go into templates where we sort of put it all together in the form of like a page layout, but really the template, as the name implies, is just like largely the kind of the scaffolding or like the sort of, skeletal system of it. And then it's really at the page level of atomic design where we're kind of pouring real product experiences, real sort of representative content, data, application state. Is the user logged in or not? Is this like a homepage with like a, big hero image with like a bunch of smiling people versus a sort of a more of a swirly background gradient kind of thing. And so it's like kind of through that lens of the page, the real products experiences that our real users will see, it's kind of at that stage that we're really validating or invalidating the design system that's making up that experience. So that's where so there's kind of 5 stages that all happen concurrently. It's like, this is like a simultaneous, like just kind of mental model.
Yep.
Atoms, molecules, organisms, templates, pages. And what it's really doing is kind of connecting the design system to the products that that design system serves. And that's like one of like the biggest things that I encounter as I sort of see and witness a lot of different design system efforts at a lot of different companies, is that still is the like one of the biggest sort of tripping up points, is people going, I don't understand. Like, we like have our buttons, we have our form controls, we have our carousels, we have like all of this stuff. And like nobody on this product team like wants to use it. And it's because this stuff is just kind of like floating around in the ether. And it's like, you really do need to like sort of bring those worlds together and create this kind of feedback loop between the product experiences and the product design and development and the design system design and development. And once you have that in place, you have this sort of virtuous cycle that the improvements to and additions to the design system inform and influence the types of products that you can make. And then the types of products you make and what they need inform and influence what goes into the design system. So atomic design is kind of a vehicle for sort of establishing that virtuous cycle between design system and product design.
Yeah, I think one of the most helpful mental models for me when reading through your book was kind of one thing you say is like, don't just think about these as pages. Don't think about pages, at the first step. Think about all of the pieces that make up the page. And when you think about those pieces that make up the page, you can abstract, the header or the hero. And if you build them independently, you can, resize them, play with them, see if they work well on their own. And then the idea is like, if you build the atoms right, the molecules right, you kind of build them in isolation, you take time to perfect them and to like, build them together. When you organize them on the page, it's really just a matter of putting all of your work together in kind of Lego blocks, right? That's the easy part, is putting them on the page. It's just the like, if you spent all the time building the integrity of these components up front and think about them deeply on that level, the page becomes easy. But it's like previously when you're building out a website, and you're trying to build it all on that one page, you're considering everything. It's just impossible to organize. It's impossible for you to like have consistency. One page, it looks fine. The other page, and it's just like the page level is just far too deep of a pool to jump into from like elements to page.
Yeah. But it's like that it is such an important part of the story, because obviously like that's how people experience the UI and
right.
So that's why it's like a both and, right?
Yeah.
It's this ability to sort of zoom in and out depending on what you're trying to do. Frank Camaro in his book, The Shape of Design, has this really lovely story. He says like, that the painter, when at an easel, sort of approach, sort of a step back, looking at the whole canvas, and then sort of zooms in and approaches the canvas and makes a mark. And then once they do that, they sort of take a step back to see what that sort of zoomed in, like specific mark did to the overall composition. And that's the kind of dance of like zooming in and out with the design system and stuff. Is like, like you want that whole picture. You want to paint that page level picture. But as you're sort of alluding to, like, that's not the best place to actually like do that development. It like, you can assemble it and sort of have it in line and sort of say like, how does this feel? How does this look? How is this holistic experience? But then you're like, oh, that header is too jumbo size. So you're going to zoom into that header organism and sort of do that work there and be able to isolate it and play with it and tinker it. And then you're able to zoom back out again once you've made changes to sort of shrink it down a little bit. And then you're able to say, how does that feel now? So there's this kind of, again, this sort of dance of sort of like zooming into specific components, but then zooming out to see how changes to those components affect the entire experience. And the cool thing is that like once you have more pages represented, there's sort of like templates and pages represented and connected to your design system, the more easy it is to sort of make some design level and system level changes. You could go like, what if we wanted to change our buttons from blue to orange? What does that look like? How would that impact all of our product experiences? You go, okay, well, let's, come over here in a new branch or whatever and change our buttons from background blue to background orange. And then you're able to say, update all of these pages to see what that would do.
Right.
And you can make a call like, that looks great or that looks garish, right? So it's like, that's the fun of it, is that you're not like sort of like, in the abstract kind of philosophizing around like, oh, like if we were to do this, or what if we were to like sort of tweak our, change our type scale. And like we do a lot of work where like there's these inflection points where our clients are like rolling out the rebrand. And of course there's always like a rebrand on the horizon. And so they're like kind of doing that exercise of it's like, what does it look like? Sort of totally rehash our experience and change our typography, change our colors, change our iconography. And whenever you have all of this stuff kind of wired up to a design system, it's actually like a very easy exercise to sort of make these changes and see what those changes ripple effect is. Which is really cool.
That is cool. So you wrote this blog post, you had this idea. Tell me a little bit about the impact of that blog post. Did that kind of like rocket launch you into the stratosphere, and why write about it versus just kind of keeping it as your secret sauce?
Oh, yeah. I'll say that through my sort of work around sort of responsive design and stuff, like kind of started, building a bit of a reputation and stuff. And I'll say, so ever since 2008, just kind of, blogging and sort of getting the hang of that. And whenever I kind of like landed in this whole, mobile web development kind of thing, and there weren't a ton of voices or a ton of sort of resources or things to read in that world, I kind of, you would use that as like a way to sort of share what I was learning, but also largely as like please, for the love of God, help me, because I'm struggling with all of these like very difficult things. And like, that is an amazingly powerful way of getting help is to like sort of publish these things, just even like blog posts that will just sort of do nothing but frame a problem is such a great way to sort of solicit solutions to said problem.
Yeah.
And so I kind of like, I learned that through my work of those days of just like, this is great. But I'm also like the Zeldman school of like web, sort of design and things like that. So it's like really, sort of a champion for the web and the openness that it provides. So it's kind of like really baked into me. Like, I think it's really important for people to share their own experience, to blog about what they know and what they don't know and everything in between. And so I'll say that with the kind of, birth of Atomic Design, I'd already kind of like laid a good sort of blogging foundation, and was starting to already sort of at conferences and stuff like that. And that definitely kind of took off. And then of course, like with the proliferation of all of these devices and more sort of software being built at more and more places, I think that like in kind of 2015-ish and 2016, and certainly by like 2017, it was like, we actually like want a design system. Like this is, it used to be in like 2013 to 2015 was more like we're going to throw this like pattern library thing. We don't know what to do with it. That like, we're going to throw that in the trash can. We're not interested in that. We want the new responsive site. But over time, it was like this. We have like all of these different sites, all of these different apps. We have all these different teams designing and building all these different buttons. And like, we should probably do something about that. So I was kind of like positioned by way of sort of blogging and stuff to kind of like get in there.
Yeah.
So that's, I think, like a big piece of advice for any listener out there is just blog a lot, blog about what you know, blog about what you don't know, blog about things that you think that other people have already written about at length, blog about like just anything really. It is like an immensely, like I owe my career to it 100%. And I know that other people that have gone down that road feel similar about it.
Yeah,
It's just a really powerful vehicle for sharing yourself and sharing your expertise and getting that expertise, but also getting help. It is like a very, it is give and a take for sure.
So your career would probably look very different if you had never published any blog posts.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Hands down.
Wow. So what made you then think like, I want to take this from a blog post, the philosophy of atomic design, to a book format?
Yeah, that's a good question, actually. Like it all felt very natural. We'll say it was here's this thing. I'm going to sort of get it out there. I started talking about it, and also in my day-to-day work, like started like implementing it more with increasing success. And it was like, okay, there's definitely like a lot of meat to cover. And it kind of felt like, this is more than just like a series of blog posts or something like this. Is like, this is actually like something that feels like a book length kind of thing. And, sort of selfishly, like always kind of, it's like, oh yeah, it'd be cool to be able to sort of, say, oh, I wrote a book or
the book on design systems.
that certainly wasn't what I was like out to do, but it felt like a natural extension of the sort of thing that I was poking at is like, oh, this actually feels like we've sort of amassed enough of a working theory, as well as some sort of like real world sort of examples to kind of like back it all up with, that we felt, I was like, yeah, this feels good. So it kind of like crystallized it encompassed it all in one sort of area. And I'm very, very pleased with how that all went.
Yeah.
And continue to be pleased with how it's all gone. So.
Absolutely. So, one thing I'm curious about is like how you sell design systems, right? Because it's like a design system in and of itself isn't really like anything. It's what people want that comes from a design system, right?
Yes.
So it's like, I would imagine it's kind of a hard sell because you're not selling a design system. You're selling the future vision of your product that uses one.
Yeah. That's very well said. That's very well said. That's it. And that's really it. It's like seen on its own, it's perceived as a cost center. It's like, this is a distraction from us getting real work done. And whenever it is positioned that way, even for the ones that like they were successful in sort of selling it, it's like, no, trust us, we need it. As so long as it's being perceived as this thing that is like kind of this off to the side or not necessarily connected to the real sort of product and organizational sort of like initiatives that they're trying to get done. I don't want to say it's like a sure thing that it's going to be dead in the water, but it makes it very, very difficult to kind of keep at it. The whole purpose of a design system is to, as you just said, really like unlock the future of how your products are designed and built. And if it's not doing that, it's failure, right? Just straight up, like that is important to say. It will hang out as a design exercise, as a development exercise, as like this is a fun little side project or sort of thought experiment. But in order to really make this stuff successful, it has to serve the organization and obviously the users that the organization is trying to reach. So that becomes the sales vehicle, right? So the sales vehicle becomes, and this is what we do in our work a lot. And it's kind of fun as outsiders where we're able to just kind of come in with like a totally unbiased, we have no force in this race, whatever. And we get to talk to people. So it's like our engagements, we'll like kind of talk to C-level people. We'll talk to like product owners. We'll talk to product managers. We'll talk to designers. We'll talk to developers. We'll talk to like leadership in their respective disciplines and kind of get at like, what are you trying to get done? Like what's going on? What are you like, what are the things that are going well? What are the things that aren't going well? But also just like, yeah, like what are you trying to get done? And the design system, again, needs to be positioned to help facilitate and advance that and accelerate that. And if it doesn't do it, then then what are you doing? Right. So that kind of becomes the thing. And so like the sales pitch really varies depending on like who you're talking to. If you're talking to an executive and they're saying, oh, like we want all of these things to grow our user base by this much or whatever. And then you talk to like the head of design and they're like, oh, we need like the redesign to be rolled out, by the end of Q3. And then you talk to like the head of technology and they're like, no, we're like trying to, sort of consolidate our tech stack to, get these things sort of migrated away from the old ASP.NET sort of tech stack and onto a new modern tech stack. You need to be able to sort of say, cool, here is how the design system will help with those things, right? So it's like that is the vehicle and that is the lens by which to pitch the design system. And again, it is necessary to understand at a very deep level what they are trying to get done. So then you meet them there rather than you kind of coming to the table and sort of, we could talk about consistency. We could talk about speed and velocity. We could talk about, accessibility. We could talk about all those things. If those aren't mapped to where the headspace of the people on the receiving end of that, it's like, that all sounds great in theory, but like, I'm over here worrying about this stuff, right? So it's like, that's the real sort of trick. Is meet them where they are. What's keeping them up at night, or what are they worrying about, or what are they excited by? And usually those things kind of go hand in hand. And then it's like, then that becomes the pitch, right?
That's super fascinating.
We'll do that. Yeah.
Because I think most of the time that I've pitched design systems, it's been around, consistency. It's going to help you in the long run. It's an investment. It's going to make your team more productive. And everyone thinks that sounds great. Like, yes, of course I want the team like productive and the app consistent.
Yeah.
But it's usually something where it's like, okay, well, while we build your product, we'll be sure to build the design system, right? So it's never been something where it's like, I specifically want this to solve this problem, which I think is a fascinating way to approach that. And yeah, so my next biggest question is, say you're into a company and you've got all of these different teams. How in the world do you coordinate them to work on a design system? And I guess you could kind of call it herding cats, right? Where everyone comes to agree to use this methodology.
Yeah. Yeah. And the short answer is you don't, right? At least not. It's not out of the gate. Like it really, you do need to sort of approach this in kind of bite-sized chunks and like accomplishable sort of chunks. So we call them pilot projects. And what pilot projects are it's like, we're redesigning and rebuilding the checkout flow. And then we go, great. We haven't started that design work yet. We haven't started that development work, but it's something that we're going to do. That's a perfect candidate for a design system pilot project, because we're able to say, okay, we're going to come in, we're going to help you, whoever the product team is that's sort of responsible for that. We're going to sort of help establish these things. And what do you get out of a checkout flow? Well, you get form controls, you get, inline check boxes, you get text fields, you get drop downs, you get things like that. You might get like a stepper nav across the top, like shipping, billing, that stuff. You might get like, some button groups and things like that. So it's like, okay, so you get some good stuff out of that. And so to sort of like partner with a team to sort of build this out and sort of get that done on time and on budget, but also built in built in a systematic way, that sort of helps, right? That gets people what they need. The design system, people sort of trying to sort of make that work happen, get good stuff out of it. The product team gets good, sturdy components out of it, and hopefully, like launches that on time and on budget. Then the next project comes along, the next pilot project comes along. This is the homepage. Less about sort of forms and sort of utilitarian stuff, and more about sort of big splashy heroes and cards and, more sort of like layouts and titles and newsletter sign up forms and sort of stuff like that. So it's like, okay, great. So putting that through the same process, you partner with that team, the design system crew, the people leading that effort can kind of build those heroes and build those cards and build those sort of like layout components and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And then sort of it becomes this game of kind of like lather, rinse, repeat of kind of sort of building up the toolkit based on what the actual products need. The analogy I use is like home improvement projects or something like that, whether you have, apartment and flat, a house or whatever. When you consider like what tools are in your toolkit, your basement, your tool shed, whatever you want to get, your garage, how did you arrive at that, at the tools you have? It was born of a real need, right? It's like the toilet's leaking. The first thing you do is go to your tool collection to say like, do I have what I need in order to fix this leaky toilet? If you don't, then you need to invest the time, energy, money to go and purchase that tool with a monkey wrench or something like that to fix the leaky toilet. Yep. Bring that home, you fix the toilet, and then what do you do with the monkey wrench, right? You put it with the other tools, right? And then you have it. So then the next time you need something that necessitates a monkey wrench, you have it, right? So that's the spirit, that's the dance here. It's like you're sort of building real stuff, like real world things that actually need to be designed, need to be built. And you sort of default to using the tools you have in your design system toolkit. But then you're able to say, oh, okay, there are some holes here. There are some gaps here. Let's like actually fill those in. And as time goes on, as things get more mature, there's fewer and fewer of those holes. And that's where like the real sort of, when we talk about sort of like accelerating teams and increasing velocity and stuff like that, that's where it like really kind of, once the team kind of come to a design system and get like 70, 80% of what they need. Okay.
Now you're cooking with oil. Yeah. So this is another thing that I've always thought of as like, it's like, okay, so you say you do that pilot project and you get form controls, buttons and all of that. And then you look back at your application per se, and you're like, oh, well, we have all of these different workflows and things that could take advantage of these things. Mm-hmm. Should we refactor all of that using the design system now? Or should we just address it if we ever need to go back? Like, what's your strategy on that type of scenario?
The latter, unless you are in the unusual circumstances of twiddling your thumbs at work and going, I don't know what to do, then sure, go and refactor this stuff and like make it work. There's a tension here, and we deal with this all the time. It's like, but wait, that means that the checkout is new and that has the new form controls, but then we have all these other pages that have the old form controls on here. Like, what do we do with that? So where like kind of consistency is for its own sake, it's not the goal to shoot for.
Yeah.
It is about like usefulness. Like you're obviously like you want to sort of minimize the amount of sprawl and design and tech debt that's out there. And the sooner you could kind of get everything sort of aligned and on the same page, the better. But at the same time, your users care about getting things done, and can they go through the checkout, and can they sort of use those other sort of form-based pages? They're not going to say these form controls like look differently. So what are you guys doing?
Yeah.
It's only a problem insofar as like the experience is broken, right?
Right.
And what these like say like legacy form-based pages, they probably are. So in that case, it's not about like, oh, we need to adopt the design system. It's again, we need to use the design system as a tool to make this experience better. So kind of treating that as that, opportunistic. Okay, cool. A lot of people are bouncing out of this experience, this form-based page, and we need this to be better. That's unacceptable. That becomes the vehicle to adopt the design system.
Sure.
So we want to do that work opportunistically because we've seen companies like sort of like do tech debt or design debt kind of like sprints and stuff. It's very unusual to get the budget for that stuff, but it's also kind of like it's trying to accomplish the wrong thing. Like consistency isn't the thing to chase. It's literally just like making the experience better. And you just happen to be using the design system to make
Makes sense.
experiences better. Yeah.
Makes sense. So when you're consulting with these folks, do you, like, for a pilot project, like build out all of the new components for them, or do you just like coach them on how to do that? How does that look?
All of those things. Yeah. So it's like, it's really, you know, there's kind of like our clients have like a certain puzzle piece shape, and then like we kind of fit our side to be a perfect fit for like what they need. And so sometimes it's like they've got a bunch of talented people on staff and all of that stuff, and really all they need is some sort of like late coaching or guidance and stuff like that. So we could kind of, you know, demonstrate, do a little show and tell, but it's like, we'll do it. We'll sort of trial this out, and then, all right, now you do it. And then they, you know, sometimes that's all a team needs. And then other times it's like, we need this whole thing. This is like really critical. And we have like Kevin, and Kevin is not enough to sort of like make this whole thing go. So it's like, we will kind of, our puzzle piece looks a bit different, right? Where we sort of like roll up with like a whole team, and we sort of help with the production. But we also like, one of the cool things about like trying to actively make ourselves obsolete is like, we will be involved in hiring a product owner for the design system team, and a lead designer and a lead developer, and like all of that stuff. So it's like, it's actually kind of fun to kind of sort of serve as a stopgap, but like really kind of our aim is to sort of like see ourselves out the door. So for like kind of building pilot projects and components and doing all of that stuff kind of right, it is this kind of like, it's kind of new muscles to flex for a lot of folks.
Yeah.
So that's where like we really kind of come in and so say, yeah, it's like, you're feeling kind of tension here. That's normal. You know, like, here's how to sort of go about doing this. Here's how you successfully collaborate with the product teams that you're partnering with. Here's how, as a consumer of this thing, and how to do it. And we'll hold your hand through that. So it's like, it's just kind of showing up and being a bit of like of a coach, and, you know, offering some reassurance and some guidance. But yes, a lot of times it's like, we actually need you to sort of get in there and build stuff like with us, and sometimes like just, you know, strictly like for us. But that's like, it's always with this, like, we're doing this because you're in a pinch. And we want to get you to self-sufficient as soon as possible. So
yeah. And then, you know, I think there's a lot of people with opinions out there that talk about where a design system lives. Obviously, it can live in a Figma file, it can live in code, and there's a lot of different thoughts around that. What's your preferred way to go about that?
Yeah. It might come as no surprise. This is talking about how my background is in front-end development, but a design system has to live in code in order for it to be successful, right? So it's back to the tools, right? Back to, you know, we're designing and building a checkout flow, right? If the designer creates a beautiful Figma library with a well-organized, you know, sort of component library, utilizing all the beautiful new sort of Figma features, variants, and all of this stuff, like, that's great. Like, you can do that. And if your development team is just like going out there and just kind of going rogue and building a bunch of like one-off things, it doesn't matter. You're not going to sort of you're not going to translate what's the picture being painted in Figma into working software. The working software is the only thing that matters. You have to keep your eye on the prize. The eye on the prize is the actual user experience that real people will see when they visit a real URL or download a real app and all of that stuff. Like, that is the only thing that matters. And I know that this is a product design podcast, and so like a lot of people sort of skew more that. This is like a big part of my work, is like, we kind of come in there, and then, you know, Josh, my collaborator, is more the design end of things. And like, we really do kind of try to put these worlds a lot closer together, because again, like, product designers often sort of take things like up until code, and then there's this thing called developer handoff. And it's just awful and terrible and and disrespectful and unidirectional. And it's like, it's all sorts of bad. It is like fundamentally flawed and broken. And it's in everyone's best interest to make better products. And making better products means stuff needs to live in code. And that's a hard and often very human problem. It's not about tools. It's not about, oh, we just need like better Figma plugins, or we just need better, sort of tools that are like sort of code to design, sort of, backfill that stuff. I'm not saying that tools don't help, but it is ultimately a people problem. But so where does a design system live? There's kind of a three-legged stool from like an assets perspective. There is a library in a tool like Figma or XD or Sketch or whatever. That's one leg of the stool. There's a code library that could take the shape of whatever sort of technologies that you're sort of building in, web components, React, Angular, Vue, iOS, Android, like whatever that's the second leg. And then the third leg of the stool is kind of what we call like the reference site, or like the sort of storefront, the documentation hub for all of this. So if you go to like material.io or Polaris.com or whatever, that's the kind of like reference where you sort of like bring all of this stuff together and write and sort of paint the appropriate sort of documentation sort of around that. So that's the kind of like three-legged asset stool of a design system. It's not one or the other. It is absolutely like this is necessary, this is necessary, and this is necessary. And they all kind of should be orchestrated and speaking the same language and be in parity with one another.
Yeah, I think it's tough because sometimes there's applications where it's like the code is different for different platforms. So you might have a React web app, but you might have a native iOS app. And it's like, man, that becomes tough to manage because you want the buttons, basically to look the same, or lots of things that look the same, but they have very different code behind them and reference points that you need to grab. Another question I've thought is like, do you think it is necessary for teams to have like a dedicated design system manager or design system team in a lot of cases?
Yeah, ultimately, yes. In the short term, like to sort of get something up off the ground, right? When you're talking about these like pilots and you're sort of getting things going, you're building these foundations and sort of stuff like that. Like you can sort of start with like kind of a primordial team, or just kind of like we're the homepage team, but we are kind of like doing this with intention of this to kind of like live beyond our specific realm. But we just like happen to be the ones kind of like tackling this work first. So can happen kind of organically or whatever at the outset. But in order for it to like thrive and actually like take root and grow within a company, increasingly it's like, yeah, the design system team needs to be born and needs to exist.
Yeah.
And their concerns are fundamentally different, but related to that of a product team. So it's like they are a product team, and their product is this product called a design system that is powering and empowering all of the other product teams. And this is where it gets a little sort of crazy at an organizational level, because a lot of times organizations are used to what's like, there's a thing, but it's kind of behind the scenes. It's
right.
A product, and we should treat it as such. And you should treat a design system as a product. And that means that you ought to have a product team that's sort of dedicated to it. But like, it kind of scrambles people's brains a little bit, because they're like, well, wait, we have the checkout product, we have the homepage product, we have like the product detail page product, and to use an e-commerce example, stick with that. And that all makes us money. But then there's that is like, you're talking about like, this is like a whole team of people, but it's like, again, the sort of like, there's sort of an intrinsic kind of yin and yang, or tension, or push and pull. Design system team is really sort of like peering out this kind of bird's eye view over all of the different products and all the silos, and looking for commonalities and common patterns and people repeating themselves and stuff like that, and try to create good solutions that can sort of travel to all those places. Whereas individual product teams are trying to get their specific stuff and features and whatever sort of like design and build. And again, sort of a natural and necessary sort of tension and push and pull, but it really does it. Leaning too hard in one direction will go, you have a bunch of product teams that just put on their headphones, move fast and break things. Like, I don't really care what anybody else is doing. I need the select menu that does this.
Right.
That, and then game over, because you end up with all the sprawl and design and tech debt that you had to start with. Air too far on the other side, you have a component library that in theory works well, but whenever teams go to like actually plug it in to solve their problems, it doesn't do. They bump up against the edges and they're like, well, this gets me like 80% of the way there.
Right.
But I need to be 100% there. So this actually isn't a useful tool. So it really is this like sort of tension and this balancing act between not just the interfaces, the sort of virtuous cycle between like the page level stuff and the low level components, but also that sort of same spirit for the actual people involved, which is the reusable components that go into a design system, and then the need to be managed by a team that's sort of protecting that. But then the actual sort of teams that are consuming it and using it need to sort of like have a solid feedback loop and a healthy relationship with those sort of design system crews, so that you're able to sort of help each other. Right.
Yeah.
Tricky work.
That is tricky. One tension I always feel when working in design systems is like, maybe you're using a library, like a React library, as a baseline to kind of start out, right? Or maybe you're using a UI kit or whatever. And
sure.
The weird tension on the design system front for me is sometimes you open up a library or a UI kit and there are so many options, it's almost unusable just because there's no guidelines or no guardrails on the system. And then like on the flip side, you could lock things down, be really rigid, and have a very specific way in how you make cards or buttons or whatever the case may be.
Yeah.
And so I always feel that tension of like, do you be really rigid and give people answers as to like how to use it properly? Or do you open the floodgates and just let it be like fully customizable, do whatever you want? And I don't know the right answer, but
the right answer is different from organization to organization. And that's where it's like, again, you get to see things where it's like, some organizations, a lot of it has to do with the sort of competency and trust, like across an organization. It was really fascinating, just kind of psychologically speaking, we'll say. But you sort of get into the stuff where, for instance, if every single product team has fully staffed, like front end development, really strong, like front end chops, accessibility chops, and sort of things like that, then like you might err on the side of having a system that's like a little bit more open and trusting that the users can kind of pick up this stuff and assemble them and wield these sort of more sort of flexible tools in a masterful way. That typically isn't the case, where it's like you have like sort of wealth, sort of like equally distributed, like good sort of, especially on the front end sort of side. A lot of times it is you have like 2 or 3 people that really know, the sort of front of the front end stuff really well. Everyone else, all the other sort of scrum teams and stuff, like they do front end work because it's easy and they have to, but like it's given the option. And I know this through interviewing like hundreds of developers over the years. And like, they're like, if you could take that work away from me, I would love you forever. Like, right. And I love it because it's like, what it ends up doing is like freeing them up to sort of do the thing that they're really good and skilled and talented at. And then you sort of have like a design system that, yes, like builds in more and bakes in like maybe a bit more rigidity. But what it's doing is sort of like creating a healthy division of labor. So it really, like how wide open or how locked down things need to be varies from organization to organization. It also varies like from component to component and all of that stuff. But like, that's also, and you're sort of hinting at this, why reaching for and adopting third-party tools can be challenging, because like material design was not built with your specific product needs in mind, right? And so it's like you kind of get this like generic set. And I'm not saying that they can't be useful, but they aren't finely tuned for what you're trying to accomplish. And sometimes it could be so much, like you're saying, that it's overwhelming. Sometimes it's like too little. It's like, even though we adopted this thing, we still have to do a bunch of stuff on our own because there isn't a tax return component, whatever the specific thing is. So it's really fascinating. And all of this, I think maybe like reading in between the lines, a lot of the things I've been saying is like, so much of this has to do with like the specific culture and the human beings that make up that culture than it is about like just kind of run of the mill design best practices or development best practices that you could talk about in a vacuum. A lot of
therapy.
Yeah, it is the intersection between, design and code and humans.
Right. Well, Brad, this has been awesome. Really appreciate the time. And I feel like my brain has kind of expanded as far as design systems go, even just having this talk. But wanted to leave you the floor to kind of just give any advice to any product designers or developers out there who might be looking to get a little bit more involved in design systems and design system thinking before we head off for today.
Yeah, that was great. Yeah, thank you for having me. I think as far as advice goes, one thing I think is important to say is like, even though was just talking about like the importance of the formal design system team and like how to get buy-in and stuff like that, like there are absolutely ways that you just in your work right now can just start adopting a more sort of component driven, sort of reusable sort of mentality, even if you don't have a fully sanctioned and funded design system effort from the executives and stuff like that. Like you don't need to have material design. Like that is like years and years and years in the making by a lot of really talented and highly paid people. So it's like your version of that might be you are working on this new feature and just try to say like, how might this experience work? Or like, do the thought experiment of like, could I, by way of designing this thing or building this thing, position it in a way that it could be reused elsewhere? So you're not calling it homepage carousel, you're just calling it carousel, for instance. Like just like little tweaks, but like you could 100% adopt this stuff, these kinds of sort of mentalities, and you'll be better off for it. Even if you're like, but I don't have the green light from management or whatever to do it. Just start doing it, start building things in terms of sort of reusable components, create your sort of component libraries in Figma, create your reusable components in code, do things in a consistent way, do things in a way that sort of the next time you need it, you don't have to sort of tweak it or fiddle with it. It's actually none extra production work. It's more just the mental work of like, how do I make this thing more reusable?
Totally. Well, again, thank you so much, Brad, for coming on, and appreciate all of your insight and wisdom. And probably lots of people who are listening have been following along your journey, but yeah, wish you nothing but the best. And again, thank you for the time.
Yeah, you as well. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks so much for hanging out with us today on the Product Design Podcast. If you enjoyed our conversation, be sure and go follow our guests. Let them know they did a great job and you learned a lot. More to come in the following weeks as we bring on new guests. Please hit that subscribe button so that you will get these podcasts and learn a ton about the product design community. Excited to see you next time. Thanks.